So our group had the poem One Art by Elizabeth Bishop. Our group was me, Annika, Evan, Jimmy, Cohen, and Parker. So first off, this is a picture of Elizabeth Bishop. It's her middle age, just a picture of her. So on to her, about her. This was her early childhood. She was born in 1911 in Worcester, Massachusetts. Shortly after her birth, her father died before she was even a year old. And then because of her father's death, her mother suffered from terrible mental illness. She had depression, anxiety, and eventually she was institutionalized before Bishop was even 5 years old. And this took a terrible toll on Bishop. She ended up growing up with her maternal grandparents for a little bit in Nova Scotia until her rich paternal parents decided it was better to take her back to Massachusetts with them. However, Bishop became very lonely living with her paternal grandparents because she had a much closer relationship with her mother's family. And after a while, her paternal grandparents realized that she was really sad and depressed, and they sent her to go live with her mother's sister, and they paid for her housing and her schooling as long as she was happy there. And due to moving around and just being a chronically ill child, she suffered from asthma. She did not receive proper education until high school and actually struggled to get into high school for a while because she did not have any education growing up. So on to her education. Once she finally did get accepted to Walnut Hills Boarding School for Girls, which this is a picture of it right here, she decided to focus on music performance and music composure. In 1929, she was accepted into Vassar College, where she was interested in being a music major. However, as many of you all know, the stock market crashed in 1929, and she realized that although she was in love with music, it was probably not the safest idea for the time period economically, so she switched to being an English major. There, she was super successful in English. She published her first piece of work in the magazine, which was part of the college. And she also took part in creating Conspirito in 1933, alongside fellow students and friends, which was also a part of the college, like a magazine that was published through the college. It was a rebel literary magazine, and the magazine took an inside look at college life and pushed the boundaries of the unspoken parts of college, and that was one of her biggest pieces. And then after that, she continued to write and write and write. So alongside the historical context of the U.S. at this time, during her early life, the U.S. was a major economic powerhouse in the world, so the agricultural empire was expanding rapidly, plus, America was following an isolationism plan before World War I. The U.S. was able to gain a substantial amount of money through trade, and alongside the economic growth, there was also major growth in arts and music, especially which was seen during the Harlem Renaissance, which was the early 1900s. However, like I said, by the 1929, the stock market fell in the United States, and they entered the 10-year period known as the Great Depression, which led to a lot of depressing times and depressing pieces of art. So connections to her poem, One Art. One Art was published in 1979. This was a more peaceful time for the United States, so after the Great Depression, after both World Wars. However, since One Art is a piece about loss and grief, it is sort of a reflection of her childhood. As we saw, she lost both of her parents. It can also be a reflection of the Great Depression and the wars.
Okay, so poetic devices in One Art. So first is enjambment, and that's just the continuation of a sentence without pause through multiple wraparound lines and not necessarily finishing the idea in that one line. So this is found throughout the poem, essentially, but mainly in lines 2 and 3, 4 and 6, 8 and 9, 10 and 11, 13 through 14, and 16 through 19. And so what enjambment does, and especially for this poem, is it creates a seamless flow between lines. And so here it encourages audience engagement because the one line isn't the whole idea presented. You have to continue to read in order to understand the full meaning of the sentence. Next is hyperbole. And so what hyperbole does is create contrast, and it emphasizes a point or idea within a poem through over-exaggeration. So here, Bishop, in showing that losing something, whether large or small, like the cities versus the watch, is not a disaster, it creates contrast to the mother's watch while emphasizing her main idea. Next is repetition. And that was the art of losing isn't hard to master. This line is found in lines 1, 6, and 12. And then it's evident the art of losing is not too hard to master. I also included, though it isn't technically repetition, it's repetition of an idea almost. And what it does is carry a train of thought throughout the piece. And it allows Bishop to give multiple instances of losing items, of different variations under the umbrella of practicing the art of losing, which he presents as a sort of skill. Lastly is rhyme. And so while we've already talked about the rhyme scheme, what rhyme does for the poem is create a predictable sound pattern. But I especially really liked line 10, specifically the "and look, my last," or "next to last" of "Three Left Houses Went," because it still technically fits the rhyme scheme, but it places emphasis on lines 10 and 11. So I just thought that was interesting.
One Art was part of the postmodernism and confessional poetry movement during the late 1950s and into the 60s. Here are three confessional poets. Left to right, it's Robert Lowell, Anne Sexton, and Sylvia Plath. So postmodernism was developed in the second half of the 20th century. It had smaller contingents and sub-movements such as the Beats, the Confessional Poets, the Black Arts Movement, the Black Mountain School, and the New York School of Poets. Postmodernists often challenged authority, and the style of literature emerged in the context of the political tendencies during the 1960s. Their inspiration, as well as other things, showed how postmodern literature was highly self-reflexive about the political issues during the period. So, confessional poetry was during the 1950s and the 1960s, and during this period, the usage of personal pronouns went up, such as I, me, and my. And it was also in confessional poetry that they explored intimate ideas. These ideas included love affairs, suicidal thoughts, fears of failure, ambivalent or downright violent opinions about family members, as well as other autobiographical sensitive material. The innermost thoughts and sharings of one's feelings or mental health issues were also explored in confessional poetry. And in confessional poetry, it also revealed the doubts and anxieties of suburban America. The confessional poetry of the mid-20th century also dealt with subject matter that had previously not been openly discussed in American poetry. Private experiences with feelings about death, trauma, depression, and relationships were addressed in confessional poetry in an autobiographical manner. So One Art explores the idea of personal loss and grief, as well as the ideas of denial and forgetting to hide the pain of loss. These are all personal and intimate ideas that fit in with the confessional poetry. So in lines 1 through 3, the author writes, "The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster." So here it just reflects the confessional ideas of personal loss and grief and how to get through that. And in lines 16 through 19, the author writes, "Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I loved, I shan't have lied. It's evident the art of losing's not too hard to master, though it may look like write it like disaster." So here it's exploring the idea of forgetting to hide the pain of loss, but also reveals some denial of the author, as towards the end, the author needs to write down and remember the author's loved one. So overall, One Art does embody the postmodernism in confessional poetry, through exploring the personal ideas of loss, grief, and ideas of denial and forgetting.
So I did the structure of the poem. It is in a villanelle structure. So the poem is set in ABA rhyme scheme. And this poem consists of 5 triplets and 1 quatrain, which is an ABAA. So in stanza 1, it's master, intent, disaster. Stanza 2, it's fluster, spent, master. Stanza 3, it's faster, meant, disaster. And stanza 4, it's laster, went, master. And stanza 5, it's faster, continent, disaster. And in stanza 6, it's gesture, evident, master, disaster. And it's in light iambic pentameter, which is what I would describe it as. It's generally in iambic pentameter and it follows the rules, but it sometimes will deviate. Maybe there's less syllables, or sometimes it won't exactly follow the beat. So in the poem, villanelle is very rigid. It's ABA. There's not much leeway in that, or the rhyme scheme is also very strict. But it creates sort of repetition in the concepts and in the structure, but within each stanza, it gets more intense with the same underlying themes of loss. It's like a theme and variations of that theme. And as it goes, it gets more and more personal. It also helps to create a more conversational flow, as it's much more casual. As you can see in the first stanza, the art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with intent to be that loss, that their loss is no disaster. And in the last one, it says, I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster some realms I own. 2 rivers, a continent, I miss them, but it wasn't a disaster. So you can see with these 2 stanzas, this one is much more intense. The first one just introduces the concept, which would be like a theme. And then the 5th stanza would be like one of the variations where it describes losing a city, which is much bigger and much more intense. So the repetition are used to round the poem of master and disaster. So yeah, the first and last stanza both have master and disaster, which is like the beginning and end. So there's the art of losing is the hard to master. To be lost, their loss is no disaster. And then the last 2 lines also have master and disaster. And then in the middle, it goes from the very last line. The first line ends in disaster. Second stanza ends in master. Third stanza ends in disaster. 4th stanza ends in master. 5th stanza ends in disaster. So it goes disaster, master, disaster, master, disaster. And yeah. So in stanza 1, it introduces the theme that loss is an art form, and that loss is inevitable, and there's nothing to be sad about. It's very casual. In stanza 2, it pushes losing casual items like time and objects, which is also very casual, but it sort of further emphasizes this idea of loss. And then in stanza 3, it talks about consciously losing things, which is more intense. And it's about losing more abstract things like memories, concepts, like forgetting things, basically. And then in stanza 4, it would be like, it talks about losing family time, which and losing their sense of home, because it says, I lost my mother's watch. And of 3 houses went, so she forgot about her home, which is much more intense. And then this alludes to, in the author's life, her mom went to a sanatorium after her dad died. And then in stanza 5, it talks about her moving. She lost 2 cities, so she moved to different places. And I guess areas she lived in, a continent. So she misses them and she laments the past. And then a final stanza, she talks about losing a loved one, which is the most intense. As you can see, each stanza builds more and more intensity within this rigid structure. In the very end, it goes back to master and disaster. And so the last line starts out the most personal, and then it transitions back to impersonal, just talking about general art of losing. So yeah, that's the meaning within the structure of the poem, which is villanelle.
As pain and loss are inevitable, so it is important not to dwell on them. A quote that sort of portrays this is lose something every day, accept the fluster. This quote demonstrates the inevitability of loss and that one should just accept it. The second quote, none of these will bring disaster, sort of going along with the first, is saying like loss is going to happen, but it's not the end of the world, as none of these will bring disaster. For the reactions, got Annika's says that the poem.
So my reaction to the poem was that I thought it was pretty good. It was a little short and confusing, but I kind of liked that it was whimsical. The poem reminded me a lot of The Second Coming by William Butler Yeats, which was a poem we talked about last semester. And One Art plays on this idea of loss and the ability to overcome loss by practicing loss. She talks about losing common household things in hopes that it will help you learn to lose and grieve. And this reminded me a lot of The Second Coming because that poem focused on the loss and suffering in the world due to war, and they both play on the idea of what comes after loss. And so although The Second Coming talks more about what's coming after the war, it does talk about a lot about how the world has changed because of grief. And One Art plays on this idea of losing things and learning to lose things and practicing what it's like to overcome losses that are coming. So in a way, I felt like they were kind of similar in the aftermath of losing things and the aftermath of grief and war and just bad times. But overall, like I said, the poem was short and whimsical, but it did play on a serious topic. So I thought that was an interesting way for her to take a serious topic and make it whimsical and play on that. And although her advice didn't really make sense for my life, because personally I will pretty much always grieve through things and lose things, I don't think that you can really practice losing certain things, because she makes references to losing household items versus losing a person, I feel are very different things.
So for my reaction, overall, I really enjoyed this poem. I thought that the cavalier take she seems to view loss through was innovative. She relates loss to feelings that everyone has experienced, like losing something important, something sentimental, or a gift. And then she refers losing something, which loss generally being viewed as negative, as an art, as a skill, as something that you have to practice. I found that a similar attitude in that it was an interesting take on loss was taken in Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, as Oscar deals with loss, the loss of his father, in an untraditional way and sees loss through the eyes of a child. The repetition of the art of losing helps to both carry her message through the poem, but also to refresh the poem by adding new perspectives and new ideas to her main idea. And my favorite line is line 10. I talked about it a little bit already, but I really enjoy the way that last or both fits and fights the given rhyme scheme.
I thought the One Art poem was unique. It had a rigid structure, but it used its structure to emphasize certain points while also moving the dialogue along. It had a clear central idea and was able to build variations within that structure to build intensity. It presents the loss in a very casual form and then gets much more intense and personal. It gives a window into the author's perspectives and her experience, especially in the more personal stanzas, talking about her dad's death and her mom going crazy. I like this poem. I thought it was a very creative approach. Villanelle is apparently very hard to write and write well, but I thought this was executed well.
At the beginning, I kind of thought to myself, okay, this makes sense. It's important to get used to using the little things. But then towards the end, as you read it more, the narrator talks about losing bigger and more important things, like it's nothing, which, the author, when she was writing it, expressed a little bit resent, but, I didn't exactly agree. And I do think though I do agree with the overall theme of the importance of not dwelling on pain and loss too much. So Jimmy thought that the one art poem was unique. He said,
I thought that One Art was a very unique poem that was different compared with a lot of the pieces that we have read. It explored personal ideas like the idea of loss and forgetting to hide the pain of loss, and it really goes into depth of emphasizing the forgetting part. But throughout the poem, I noticed that the author becomes less advocate for this idea, wanting to remember the author's loved one by writing it down. I like this poem because it explores the idea of loss and one way to cope with it. I thought it was interesting because at the beginning, the author was very adamant about forgetting, but as the poem progressed, it ended up that the loss of the loved one is something that the author wanted to remember.